Yeah, thank you guys for hosting us.
Yeah. Alrighty. Welcome, everyone. We're just going to take a second to let people virtually file in before we get started. Um, Thank you for joining us tonight. I'm still working on getting the Jeopardy music to play while everyone files in because it's the only space filler I can think of. All right.
I can beatbox it.
I'm not going to stop you from doing that. I feel like.
Nobody wants that.
Alrighty. Thank you everyone for coming out tonight. I'm Gracie. I'm the events coordinator for print. A few little housekeeping details just before we get started. If you have any questions during the talk, please feel free to enter them in the chat box, which is on the bottom right of your screen, or in the question and answer function, which is on the bottom bar of the screen. I'd like to thank Mechanics Hall, first and foremost, for their partnership on this event. We're a little past a year into our First Friday partnership, which is usually paired with an art walk, but we're doing it virtually, and though we're sad we can't host it in their beautiful historic library, we're so thankful, I know, for their partnership and all their promotion. I'm going to quickly pass the virtual mic over to Carolyn Greenstreet, the communications coordinator for Mechanics Hall, just to tell us a little bit more about the organization.
It just occurred to me that I could actually probably do this from the library, so at least people could see some of our historic building. But anyway, for those of you who aren't familiar, I should say I'm Carolyn Greenstreet. I'm communications coordinator. Mechanics Hall is a 501c3 nonprofit organization whose mission is to inspire and enrich the community while promoting creativity, innovation, and the diffusion of useful knowledge. We do this through the stewardship of a historic building that is used as a community events venue. We also maintain the 8th oldest membership library in the country. And we have educational programming such as Maine Kids Code and our flagship program, Makers at the Hall. So a lot of our humanities programming is through partnerships and it's free, such as this one with Print Bookstore. But if you're interested in more mechanical arts and trades and crafts programming, I would suggest that you consider joining as a member because most of those programs are free for members and they cost a little bit more for non-members. So we definitely want to help promote practitioners in the arts, trades, and humanities. Currently, our building is closed to the public. However, we are doing library pickup service, which is available to members. And we are restarting our fall programming such as Makers at the Hall. We'll be moving into a virtual format with that. And you can find more information about membership and those speakers and other programs at mainmechanics.org.
Great, thanks so much. Alrighty, if you'd like a copy of tonight's featured book, The Sprawl, I can include the link to the print page right in the chat box. You can click on through. And now for our speakers. Adam Chandler is the author of Drive Through Dreams. He is based in Brooklyn, New York. Jason Diamond is the author of Searching for John Hughes and The Sprawl. He also lives in Brooklyn, New York with his wife, 2 cats, and a dog named Max. So please join me in virtually welcoming Adam Chandler and Jason Diamond.
Ooh. I should say I'm actually in New England right now, so I feel a little closer to the bookstore. So thank you again for hosting us. Adam is a good friend of mine, and I'm pretty excited that he would do this with me because his book is incredible. So if you're going to buy my book, definitely buy his because it definitely helped me it influenced how I wrote this book in a lot of ways. So yeah, so Adam, we had talked, you mentioned the intro, part of the intro from the book was something I should read. So I'll just start with that and we can just jump right into it.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, first, let me say, you look like you are in the right place to be reading about the suburbs. This is a beautiful backdrop. This is authentic, right?
Yeah. This
isn't like a fake. This isn't like a green screen.
No, this is my in-laws. I actually write about my in-laws' house. This is it. This is my wife's grandparents. Yeah, feel very masterpiece theater-y here. It's a good setting. So
yeah, I love the opening pages of the book where you discuss this like beautiful idyllic place, and now I'm actually honored that I get to see it. So I'm excited.
Yeah, it's going to be good. Yeah. Anyways, so this part that I'm going to read, it's kind of interesting. I was reading it and I was thinking about writing this pre-COVID because it's really interesting now to read these words. Um, so yeah, we'll get right into it. This is one I was really looking forward to. So thanks again. Suburbia's influence will only grow, not only in America, but also throughout the world. On nearly every continent, there are places that could be considered suburbs that have populations of over 1 million. And in the US, while there's been a lot of talk about the boom some of our once forgotten cities have experienced over the last decade, the fact is, the suburbs are still growing. According to the Brookings Institute, the 53 major metropolitan areas across the country outpaced suburban growth in 2010 and 2011 and 2014 and 15. But in 2015 and 16, city growth declined 0.82%, while the suburban growth rate also dipped from the previous year. It was still above its urban counterpart with a rate of 0.89% growth. Cities are great. I live in one. I wrote the bulk of this book from my apartment in Brooklyn, in a library on 42nd in the heart of Manhattan. Yet the suburbs are legion, and people argue they're more livable than cities. They offer so many of the things I hear my other friends in cities complaining they miss. From more space to less noise all the time. Yet we keep staying in the city for some reason. Because our jobs are here, we can walk to the subway or to the little restaurant that serves the best fried chicken or the bar that makes the best Bloody Mary. Stuff is happening in the cities. As one person told Al Jazeera in 2017, it's the culture, the food, the shopping that keeps them living in a city and not a suburb. Another said, there's just something kind of cool about a big city with skyscrapers and glass windows and kind of the hustle and bustle of downtown living, adding, it's pretty cool. I've never heard anybody say that about the suburbs. While every suburb is different in some way, what links them from coast to coast is the undercurrent of strangeness, of bottle up energy, rage, passion, and creativity. The great suburban exports. As a structured and structuring way of being, suburban sprawl foments a kind of imaginativeness in people that's both unique to the boring suburban imagination and reflective of an alienating longing for the urban lifestyle. These emotions engendered by living in the suburbs are consistent over time: anxiety, boredom, and alienation. Understanding how and why the suburbs are this way can help us better understand the present and the future, whether we live in the suburbs or not. Because America, by moving farther out from the cities and buildings, new subdivisions filled with single-family households, bordered by malls and office parks, created modern suburban sprawl. But in the end, that sprawl reshaped America, became our modern condition, a state of mind, more stuff, more cars, more houses, more stores, and less of what we need. The suburbs were a smart, practical idea that was put into practice in all the wrong ways, and they deserve to be scrutinized. This book isn't a celebration of the suburbs as an idea or a way of life. Rather, it examines how the suburbs came to be what they are today, how much they've influenced our world, and what we can learn going forward since the suburbs aren't going anywhere anytime soon. All right. Mr. Chandler, how you doing?
So, can you hear me? Okay, great. I'm actually in suburban fashion dealing with Arby is here. Arby, knock it off. I want everyone to meet Arby in a minute, but what I really like about, this introduction, first of all, is that it gives us kind of a working definition of what the suburbs are. And what I think is useful about that is, these are places we hear about all of our lives. We hear about the suburbs from people we meet in college, Arby, from people that we, from Arby. Sorry, hang on a second.
Arby just wants to be part of this.
He is a suburban dog right now, and he's not used to it. He grew up being a city dog, and he can't handle it. Anyway, so what I think is meaningful, hold on, I'm just gonna let Arby say hello.
Hello, Arby.
There we go. And I hope Max shows up too at some point for this. what I think is meaningful about the suburbs itself is that they're familiar and distinct at the same time. It's kind of a credit to your book that you really hit on the fact that there are so many stories that feel both familiar and also unique to the places where they are and where they take place. And so I guess if there are a couple of examples you want to bring up that really hit on that, I think that's a nice way to start off the conversation. You bring up all these cultural reference points that we know from popular culture, but we also kind of feel intrinsically in our roots. I mean, it's sort of, even if we didn't live them, it's sort of an experience that feels sort of communal in a way. And I think that that's one thing that you really like notch perfectly in the book, is the sense that we all know exactly what we're talking about. Suburbs are shorthand for something, and that's meaningful.
Yeah, I mean, definitely like one of the ones, you know, I had mentioned this to you when we were talking about this. I really wanted to sort of hit on this one specific part where my friend and I were sitting outside at the same place that Anthony Bourdain grew up going to as a kid. And I was thinking about that. And even before I wrote it, that part really kind of sat with me about the places I sat when I was a kid. Like these little places that only might be special to me and the people that grew up, you know, where I grew up, or, you know, the places where you grew up that are special to you. But something about those places, these places that other people might not know about, I feel like we all sort of have them in our suburban. If you're from the suburbs, especially, you have these places that are really fixed in your memory. And I'm always kind of fascinated talking to people and finding out about, like, oh, there was this place that we went and got chicken dinner from when I was a kid, and they had like the big potato wedges and we would eat it outside. Or, you know, like the weird restaurant with all the strange decor, or like a playground that they had like modernist swing sets, you know. Like, I love hearing about that kind of stuff, and the places that sort of stand out in the suburbs. You know, I think a big part of like researching this was just observing. I mean, that's what journalism is. It's observing. And I don't consider myself a journalist, but I do consider myself an observer. And I kind of felt like I had to be more of a journalist while writing this. And, you know, driving around a lot of the suburbs that I visited, I would just notice like the smallest things, from like weird signage to just like restaurants that seem to only be part of that neighborhood. And I just kind of was fascinated. I just fell in love with this idea that, you know, we still have things that are of certain places. And I think that's great.
It's not just that it's not that it's just of a place. It's that it is, you know, it's not just the familiarity we're talking about here. It's that there's kind of a common narrative to how the suburbs came about. And I think that maybe that's one aspect of it. You know, in my book, which talks about the history of fast food, but obviously in this book too, there is a common story of how the suburbs came to be. And if you don't actually know the history of it, it really is fascinating. I didn't know the history of it.
Yeah.
So thinking about how we all collectively, and not collectively in a way that was necessarily equity minded or fair or just, created these places. And so, you know, can you talk a little bit about the creation of the suburbs as a historical phenomenon?
Yeah, of course. I mean, I look at it as two parts. I joke, I call it the proto suburbs. So technically the first suburb in America is Brooklyn Heights, which a lot of people are surprised when I'm like, hey, you just walked through the first suburb in America. But when you think about it, in the 19th century, when you have this pretty disgusting place that is Manhattan in the 1800s, just, you know, just diseases, all kinds of just, you know, smog, terrible. And you're rich enough to be like, hey, I need to get out of here. And I could just hop across the water and go to this really nice place that was Brooklyn Heights. And so places like Brooklyn Heights, there are places all up and down the Eastern Seaboard you could find that predate what we consider the modern suburb. And then, you start going out to the Midwest and you go to places like outside of Detroit, outside of Chicago, and you start seeing these like really leafy, we were just driving through Scarsdale today and through Westchester, and I'm like, it's so funny how the Midwestern suburbs close to Chicago look so much like this, because it's the same idea. It was these places that were close enough to the city, but were also far away enough. And so then, you have that, you have these places that only a certain people could afford, and only certain people could be let into. So you have a place like Roland Park in Baltimore, which is still a lovely, leafy, just great place to drive through. But I mean, explicitly, no blacks, no Jews. This was a very common theme doing my research. You would see it explicitly was written into town charters. Like I read one that was somewhere in the Midwest that was something to the effect of like no swarthy Europeans or something like that. It was like really funny. The language they baked into these things was, and then if it wasn't baked into the town charters, it was handshake deals. And I always joke, I'm like, I've been, my family was, it's a joke to me because it's like my self-hating Jewish thing, but my family in the 20th century was denied membership to country clubs. And in the letters, they would say, we appreciate what you've done for, your community, but we don't accept your race. It's like, that was a very commonplace thing in the suburbs well until the 1960s. When Johnson enacted laws that changed that. But so you have the proto suburbs, and then you have the post-war the Levittown suburb, which Levittown has just become shorthand for everything that's wrong with the suburbs. And the Levitts, it's a fascinating thing. They were Jewish people, and Jewish people had a hard time buying houses in Levittown. And through things like redlining, Black people were pretty much not allowed to buy outside of cities for decades after the war, after the Second World War. So it's these were places that for many years, the American dream was held just far enough in front of the faces of people who wanted to who may have worked their butts off, made more than enough money to get out of the cities, but if you were Black or Jewish or in some cases Catholic, there were people who would keep you out, and that's stuck with the suburbs. It still lingers to this day.
Right. What I really liked in the book is talking about the example of Chief Keef as a someone who kind of speaks to the durability of this idea. That whole chapter 3 called Not Allowed is really like an instructive way of seeing how durable the idea of exclusion is even today, and Get Out as a great movie that kind of speaks to a certain, even we may consider it to be a conservative principle of kind of exclusion, but it's also a liberal one too in the right circumstances, in the right percolator. So
absolutely.
Yeah, I love the Chief Keef anecdote. Could you just tell a little bit about that?
Yeah, I was kind of tipped off to that because he was, I mean, what I had heard initially is a rapper named Chief Keef, who, if you aren't familiar with him, I mean, he was, I would say he was like probably for like a hot second, he was like the hottest young rapper probably in America for like a minute, like right after like Lil Wayne kind of, he had a moment there where like everybody was bidding on him. And, he comes from the South Side of Chicago, which, the South Side of Chicago is a funny thing because I'm a big fan of stereotypes, and people hear the South Side of Chicago and they think the same thing of, the Bronx or Brooklyn or this dangerous, scary place. And, you know, the south side of Chicago has a lot of suburbs. Like there's a lot of southern Chicago suburbs, but there is the real like south side part that, you know, the city just forgot about it. They were like, well, you know, we don't want to deal with it. So we're just going to let it be this place where all this violence and terrible stuff happens. And that's where he's from. And he tried to get out of there, and he had a house in a McMansion in the suburb right next to where I went to synagogue as a kid, which I could tell from experience, you know, there just aren't, growing up, I don't recall ever seeing Black people in that neighborhood. And just his being there was controversial to people. Like, oh, it's a rapper from the South Side. And it turned into a whole thing. It literally became national news. This rapper was living in the suburbs, and all of just the entire neighborhood was up in arms against it. And they were saying, oh, we could smell, one guy said, I think, like, I could smell the pot smoke drifting in the air. It was very poetic the way the guy said it.
Yeah, I love that. It was like the smell of dope reaches you when the wind is right. It was sort of like Chaucer talking about it or something.
Which was like growing up on Lake Michigan, because I always joke, I'm like, I grew up and down the lake, but like I kind of know that what he's talking about, because like the stuff does drift, but it was just so no one cares that much. But it's a Black guy, and he's a rapper, and I remember it was really fascinating to me. There was a photo of him with these like just 3 blonde white girls, and I remember I was looking at the comments, and people were just, I mean, it was just like old school racism. I mean, people were, I actually shouldn't even say old school racism, because it's like, it's never gone away. But, you know, it was just like, it was a sign that people in that suburb were just definitely not comfortable. And, you know, I tied it back to, you know, 20 years earlier or so, 30 years earlier, Mr. T moved to a neighborhood, literally the neighborhood next door. And that was a whole thing. Like Mr. T moved to a neighborhood that to this day, if you go on its Wikipedia, says it didn't allow Black people or Jewish people until the 90s. And this was like 1985 that he moved to that neighborhood. So it was kind of funny to me to like, just kind of go back and see just like how close it wasn't funny, but how close this is to where we are now. It's like, it hasn't changed. It's just different ways of looking at it. I'm not going to say Chief Keef was perfect. Like he definitely was like causing, you know, he was like up and down riding his dirt bike at all hours in the morning. But still, the fact that it was a Black man from the South Side living in the suburbs that just really, I think, affected people.
Right. There's a real, you know, fish out of water. The suburbs is this idyllic place where all of these things are supposed to happen, and things are not supposed to happen. That really makes it ripe for cultural parody.
Yeah.
For the things that we constantly see, and you do a really great job of kind of interweaving and sort of assimilating all of these really fascinating cultural artifacts of what the suburbs mean. And again, the weird is in the subtitle of your book, which I think is important because the suburbs are inherently weird. If you were to kind of isolate maybe your favorite or one of your favorite cultural artifacts from the book that speak to the suburbs, what would it be?
You know, it's funny. I've gotten asked kind of like, oh, what's the movie you would pick? And I keep saying Over the Edge. And I think I'm going to go with that. There's a lot of things I can go with. I mean, I could go with like the Misfits. You know, I spend a lot of time talking about the Misfits, the punk band, the Misfits. Because when I went to the town they're from, if you've ever heard the Misfits, I was kind of like taken aback. I was like, this is where the Misfits come from? Like, I was expecting to, you know, Goth Town, USA, but it's this working class Italian suburb. But I would say Over the Edge. It's this 1979 movie, you know, that I dedicated pretty much an entire chapter to. You know, I saw it when I was a teenager, when I was a kid. and it's just stuck with me my entire life. It just kind of it's like it's in this very like late 1970s, early 80s, like teens are dangerous. Teensploitation was a very real subgenre, and to me, it's like it's basically the suburban version of the Warriors in a lot of ways. um, Except it's more. It also kind of has this like after school special kind of feel to it, where it has that like kind of like it's hard to explain the music if you haven't seen any of these movies, but it's just this really it doesn't for all its like cheesy 1970s late 1970s early 80s stereotypes. It just kind of nails what it's like to be bored in the suburbs, and being bored in the suburbs, man, I mean, it's tough. I remember it very well. It was not easy. So
Right, right. It's funny because you know the things you read about are from. I grew up in Houston, which is the fourth largest city in the country, but
it's a lot of suburb.
It's all sprawl, right?
Yeah.
And so we spent plenty of time in the fourth biggest city in the country, hanging out in Starbucks parking lots, and you know going to Whataburger and McDonald's or doing our thing. And it wasn't that exciting, even you know even a place where there was a lot of activity and diversity in theory. There was still that kind of shelter mentality that runs into it. You know, I'm curious because of obviously we're dealing with a moment, and this book is you know kind of perfect for it in a lot of ways, where the suburbs are coming back into conversation as people, you know, leave the city, whether it's temporarily or permanently, or you know, we're in a campaign season where the suburban demographic, the suburban vote, the suburban bloc is being courted. You know, and there are a lot of sort of pearls of wisdom about what that is code for in a lot of ways. I'd love to get your take on, you know, what does it kind of mean to when we hear the suburbs kind of invoked as some kind of bastion of American culture, or something that has some purity to it. You know, how do you feel having devoted all this thought to the topic?
Well, I mean, it's really, I mean, obviously, there's 0% chance that I could have figured, oh, this book would come out in the middle of a pandemic where the New York Times is able to find enough people to write a trend piece that everyone's moving back to the suburbs, which I don't necessarily. Like I said in the preface, it was already starting to kind of happen. Like millennials, if they are buying homes, they were buying them in the suburbs before this. So I mean, obviously that's all very weird, but something I write about in the book, and you know, I figured this would be an important topic with the book coming out in 2020, is that every 4 years the suburbs become hugely important. Nobody talks about the suburbs until like it's like we've spent the last few years trying to like dissect. You know, we've both worked in media. You know, especially we've worked in outlets where politics are kind of a big deal, and it's kind of interesting for me to have sat and watched the last 4 years of like every media outlet trying to dissect the rural Trump voter, or the Pennsylvania independent. You know, like I was like, why aren't they just going out to the suburbs? Like, you're gonna be in the suburbs come 2020 anyway. That's where elections are won and lost. Florida is, I mean, I always joke, Florida is a state that's just a bunch of suburbs. You know, it's the most suburban state in America, and you know, whatever happens in Florida pretty much could define the election. Same goes with Pennsylvania in a lot of ways, but you know, I was kind of surprised, having done this for the last few years, since 2016. I was kind of surprised how long it took people to start talking about the suburbs, in terms of what it means for the election. But you know, once they did, it was in the context of Trump talking about the suburban way of life, which to me, you know, having, you know, I'm a writer. I pay attention to language and to words, and I notice a lot of dog whistles, and the suburban way of life to me just it sounds like a dog whistle to be like, hey, you don't want low income housing, which I feel like that's definitely that translates very easily to poor people or people of color, and it's interesting that he would use a lot of those terms because I don't know if his people understand that one, there's a lot of poverty in the suburbs. There haven't been a lot of extensive uh, studies into this, but the ones I have looked at, I mean, there are people suffering in the suburbs all across America. You know, poverty is, it doesn't judge what your religion is, what your skin color is. Poverty is all across the board, and there's poor people all across the suburbs. And the fact that low income housing is something, I understand why people might hear that and they might assume, oh, that's, you know, bad for us. But low income housing could actually help the suburbs. So I found that really interesting. And I also, you know, while I was in the middle of researching this, you know, I would see a lot of really fascinating articles about people in the suburbs getting more active. And I mean, in the midterm election, when you go back and look at the numbers, a lot of those seats that were flipped, you can pretty much thank the suburbs for it. You know, outside of Atlanta, you know, I just saw tonight, I mean, I don't know how much water this holds, but Biden, according to 538, now has a 1 point lead over Trump. That's all suburban voters. I mean, the suburban voters outside of Atlanta are very, like, that's been a very red part of the country for a long time. And 2016 came around, and, or excuse me, 2018 came around, and things started to kind of change. And it was, you know, Rebecca Tracer had a really interesting piece for New York Magazine about women in those traditionally red parts of Georgia, suburban women coming out and getting very active. And that's something I think that's being very underreported right now is just how active people in the suburbs are getting leading up to this election.
Yeah, and you know, it's obviously it's important to see how this is all playing out, because it is something we really hear a ton about, and then, like, kind of like you say, it goes dark for a while, and then all of a sudden the suburbs are back in play. It really is this really strange kind of political dance that we have back and forth. I think now is probably about when we turn to questions from the audience. I do want to apologize again for Arby, who, you know, after pitching a fit is now completely passed out on the floor. But you know, I have to say, for somebody who there's a lot of context in your book that I think is important right now, and I'm grateful to you for it, because it's easy to dismiss the suburbs. It's easy to kind of write them off. It's weird in the way that we kind of assume that nothing really happens there, when the reality is that kind of everything happens there. It really is where mainstream culture kind of lives and thrives. It's where the baseline understanding of everything kind of percolates in a way that I think is interesting. And you know, the book really hits on it. And you know, thank you for taking the time to meditate on it, because it is important. And it really is something that defines us in particular as a country. I mean, if you look to what made the suburbs, especially in the post-war era that we're talking about, you know, the creation of a commute is a product of the suburb. You know, the rise of dual income households in a lot of ways has to do a bit with the suburbs and what the way that post-war life was constructed, car culture,
the way we eat.
Yes, the way we eat. Right, exactly. I pride myself on being a fast food scholar, embarrassing though it is. But that's
I drop your name all the time. I'm like, I know the foremost. So.
Yeah, but no, and the reason we have fast food is because of the suburbs. You know, this was a product of highway driving and the need for quick convenience, and the fact that car culture was basically codified in post-war America, with the interstate highway system being built and the suburbs being a place for people to live, and the GI Bill kind of funneling people out there, and then the redlining and restrictions. I mean, you talk about it all. So anyway, I could go on about this forever, but let's see if are there some questions. You probably have a thought to share.
Is it okay if I say one? Yeah.
Yeah, go right ahead.
No, I mean, what's really interesting to me, you know, and this is why I specifically wanted to talk to you, besides you being a good friend. And I don't get to do a lot of these like things with like really close friends, which is kind of interesting. So I always worry we'll just get into our normal routine. But something that's kind of fascinating to me is, and you know, with your book, you know, you do a great job of kind of humanizing, you know, the people who made fast food part of our everyday life. And you know, like I mentioned earlier, you know, your book had an influence on kind of how I ended up shaping this book in the long run. But you know, it's really fascinating to me is you look at the suburbs, the modern American suburb, and you look at cars, and you look at fast food, and you look at all of these things that I think that all really came up at the same time as part of our American way of life after the Second World War. And it's really fascinating to me that it all became so easy. Like you could just have a house, you know, you could just have a hamburger. You could just, this is yours. You're going to get these things. And they're just going to be, it's just going to be so easy. And that's the thing. It's like I learned through writing this is nothing should be that easy.
Right.
You know, and now we're learning, you know, 50, 60, 70 years later, the consequences of ease, of having it all. And I kind of, you know, obviously I would never begrudge you for being such I like the idea of fast food. I don't eat fast food anymore. I was very upset about Taco Bell getting rid of the Mexican pizza. Because
you still have 2 more months. You have 2 more months.
The great vegan. I was vegan for a long time, and it was everything to me. But you know, it's like we look at the environmental impact all of these things have had. The suburbs, cars, fast food. It's fascinating, like just the impact these things have had on not just our culture but our world. And I think there's just a better way of doing things. And I think to just dismiss anything, you know, that's why I loved your book, because most people would just, there's 2 kinds of people that I know of when it comes to fast food. There's, oh, that's disgusting, I won't ever eat there. Or there's the people who try to be a little bit more high-minded about it. And I like the middle. I like the middle where there's a critical kind of way of looking at something. And that's what I wanted to do with this, because if you're ever 100% rah about anything, you should be very careful. You should never be 100% into anything. You should always come to everything. It doesn't matter if it's a burger from McDonald's or Ranch Home on Long Island. You should always have a critical mind about what's good, what's bad, what's interesting about this. And
absolutely, these things are artificially cheap for a reason, and the reasons aren't necessarily good. And that's that. But there are still the people who are eating them or living there for the sake that they want something that is comfortable and easy to attain, and that's meaningful too. So we're always in this kind of push and pull of priorities. But anyway, we could go on forever, and you know, hopefully we will be able to do that in person sometime. Maybe not on Zoom, and maybe not with my dog, but yeah,
or maybe with your dog.
Or maybe with my dog. Let's turn it over to questions and see who's out there in Zoom land.
Yeah, I have a few questions.
I was stalling because I didn't think you actually would have had questions.
I do. I got some.
I'm always worried about that.
It's Friday night.
Yeah. Exactly. All right. This is a specific question for Jason, someone who hasn't read the book yet. Did you notice, so it might not be included, did you notice a difference between East and West Coast suburbs apart from obvious physical differences?
Well, I mean, obviously age. West Coast suburbs are definitely newer. I mean, driving through California, especially like when you go out to LA, um, to me that LA kind of in a way reminded me almost of Houston, where you're like, where do these places stop and start? Because what's the joke about LA? Like, it's not a city; it's 33. So it's like there's an inside joke about LA that I really liked, but that was really fascinating to me. And obviously the Bay Area, because I think they keep expanding what the idea of the Bay Area is. I didn't get up to the Pacific Northwest as much as I would have liked to. So I'm kind of one day hoping to make it up there because, like I mentioned, I write a little bit about garage rock. I actually write a lot about garage rock, which is the most suburban sounding musical genre of all time. And the Sonics are from Tacoma. And the fact that like maybe one of the greatest, in my opinion, greatest distillations of American rock and roll comes from the Pacific Northwest, and Jimi Hendrix is from there, and I got to go up there at some point. But I definitely find that, and this is just my more philosophical kind of point of view, but I do find that the sort of distilling of of, of anger and angst on the West Coast, be it like punk rock or the grunge stuff from the '90s, is definitely it's more interesting to me, and it's what I grew up on. So I definitely am kind of fascinated by the West Coast and the suburbs, because to me it's a little bit more foreign, because my whole life has been the Midwest and the East Coast.
I actually learned the other day that in 1967, Jimi Hendrix opened for the Monkees, which is
Yeah,
the weirdest pairing of all time.
and they booed him. They booed. I think.
Oh, it did not go well. It did not go well.
Yeah.
All right.
Can you imagine being one of those people that booed Jimi Hendrix because he wasn't the Monkees?
Yeah.
How do you live with yourself? Like
they changed Foxy Lady to Foxy Davy when he tried to get them to sing along, which is a little hard to process. All right. This is for both of you, actually. How do you narrow down research? The topics you both address are broad in a way, but also have ties that are economic or political or personal. Do you edit your info down as you work, or is that a process that happens long after?
You go first, Adam. I actually want to hear this from you.
Well, I don't have a real process, and I'd love to meet the person who does. For me, it's kind of a hunter-gatherer. When you're working on a project, you put a lens kind of over your face, and everything you see, you kind of distill it through the lens of whatever this project you're working on. So when I was writing about fast food, I would basically think about everything in the context of fast food, which is not a healthy way to live, but is useful for research. I have to give credit to friends and editors, especially my book's editor. Her name is Bryn Clark, and she was amazing, and kind of helping to isolate what the most salient points that you want to make are. Eventually a narrative emerges. For me, I thought writing a book about fast food would mean I'm going to go on a cross-country trip and document everything that happens to me along the way. And it turns out that wasn't a very efficient way to write a book. So instead, I did it kind of historically as it lines up with American history.
I remember you were going to do it that way.
Yeah.
I think I said, is this a Travels with Charlie, except you just die at the end because
yes, exactly.
Your heart explodes?
It was exactly it. It was sort of travels with I don't know, diabetes. The whole thing was about, and I'm not trying to make that joke, but like it was really eventually a voice kind of guides you in a way that is intuitive, and that's sort of the thing that helps. So I can't say that there's a magic formula for it. It's more just kind of, there are a lot of different ways, and Jason, I'm sure you can attest to this, there are a lot of different ways that a book can turn out, especially a nonfiction book when there's so much information. And eventually just kind of a path emerges, and you do your best to see it through in a way that, makes sense.
Yeah, I actually wrote probably double what ended up in this book. I have a bunch of chapters that I didn't end up using because what I ended up doing with this was, I mean, I literally have books, notebooks in my apartment where it's like I have a circle with one thing with like it's basically the solar system. You know, it's like I didn't really want to write about I'm very like I make jokes about this in the book about how I don't want to write about David Lynch in the suburbs, but I kind of have to. And so I have David Lynch circled and all these little X's like, no, don't do this, don't do that. And so it's like 20 pages of me just trying to reason. It's really messed up. Like I'm trying to reason with myself how to write about David Lynch without sounding like a white guy getting obsessed with David Lynch, like, which has been done so many times. Like some white dude has written the great David Lynch essay 1,000 times. I didn't really want to do that. And so I just kept like whittling it down essentially. Like I really kind of have learned that anything I write is just like, I have the biggest tree you could find. And I cut it down and I'm like, I'm going to make this big ass tree into a duck, but the biggest wooden duck you've ever seen. And then I kind of start whittling it. I'm like, no, I got to be smaller, got to be smaller, got to be smaller. So everything I ever write starts out like that. And I have learned, thanks in part to editors who have beaten the crap out of so many of my pieces, to just get to that. And that's what this is. I mean, it's getting to that. It's a big piece of wood.
Yeah, trust your friends and have a brain trust, and you know it takes a village, it takes a suburb, and that's important.
Yeah, that's mine.
Should I ask mine now, Gracie? Okay. I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
So, well, it's sort of a two-part question. So, first of all, when did you stop writing this book? And you said, okay, it's okay. Like what month, year?
That's tough.
Like when did you submit it to your editor? Maybe for the first or second or third time?
November 2018. I think January of. I want to say maybe January. They might be watching this and they're gonna make fun of you. Honestly, the last decade has been a blur, but I think it was January or February of 2019. I think.
Okay.
I think, yeah.
Okay, so I've been just curious, like, this is a, difficult question. You may have already talked about this and touched on this, and I'll confess I had to step away because my mom called me on an important call. But I was wondering what has like changed, or what have you thought about this subject since the George Floyd stuff, since the protests, since this kind of awakening of systemic inequality, especially white people in the suburbs. And what context have you put this writing in since then? And how is that changed what you want to say or what you want to talk about at all? I know that's a really difficult, complex question, but
I mean, I lay it out in the preface, and this is something that that I think about a lot, because I lay out specifically that this is something that doesn't get mentioned a lot. Was Trayvon Martin and Michael Brown were killed in suburbs. They were killed in suburbs. That is, Trayvon Martin's death was in a gated community, which, it doesn't. It's kind of erased from the narrative a little bit because people don't want to look at that.
Right. People want to think that it all happened in inner city.
Right. Yeah. They want to make it. School shootings obviously school shootings, people bring, there are school shootings we don't even hear about that happen in cities. Might not be the massacres, but the school shootings we've heard about, the ones the massacres we know about, from Colorado to Connecticut to Parkland suburbs.
Yeah.
So
exactly.
I carried that with me throughout this entire book.
Yeah.
There was no way I was going to ignore that. Whether or not like people in the suburbs across the country are aware of just how close to home these things are,
Yeah.
and whether they
That's what
want to. Yeah.
right. But yeah, that's what I'm getting at this question, because I think it's what you're getting at with this book too, and this idea that this is not a no man's land. This is not a place where there's like this void and everything comes cheaply and perfect. There's a specific type of person that this comes cheaply and perfect for, and there's a specific type of culture, and there's like this system that's set up that urban and rural is not excused from. The suburbs literally hold up that, like so many of our systems, our political systems, and in so many ways they're so entrenched in like land access and who has access and who doesn't, and voting and all of these things. We tend to think of the suburbs as a place where like nothing happens, right? But really it's so connected to all of that. So
Well, the big reason I wanted to, when you do get to read the book, the reason I wanted to make the point that, I take all these real world things that have happened, be it school shootings or teenage black or young black men being killed by cops in suburbs, and I juxtapose them with art about the suburbs, is because I'm trying to point out that whether or not whether Shirley Jackson or whether Nightmare on Elm Street is supposed to be a metaphor for something, when you watch all of this stuff, or when you talk about the suburbs in any way, shape, or form, there's something, whether or not we realize it, there's something underlying.
right.
That's why I tell people, I'm like, I think Nightmare on Elm Street is a fascinating work of art, because it's the early sort of people kind of trying to be like, there's a lot of weird stuff that happens in the suburbs, a lot of bad stuff, because Freddy Krueger's a child molester.
Right.
And like the whole point of that movie is the parents just don't want to think about it.
Well, it's even the recent fascination with Stranger Things.
Yes.
It's like this underground, upside down structure that's holding up Pleasantville.
Yeah, and like Get Out was another.
Metaphor,
there are all these.
It's so realistic.
Yeah, because America just doesn't want to face its past, and I mean, I tell people all the time, I'm like, it's fascinating to me, like all the places. I grew up in Illinois, and everything in Illinois. You go to Wakanda, Illinois, or you go to all these streets are named after Native American tribes, or it's there's just so much darkness in our country that we just don't want to shed light on. And that's
I grew up on Nipmuc territory in Holliston, Massachusetts, the Nipmucs, and they're essentially been completely erased. There are plaques that say, oh, this was a Nipmuc, la la la. There's a general story about how they were abolished essentially, but there's like not a lot about these, like, who are the Nipmucs. I don't know, but I grew up on Nipmuc land.
Yeah,
and
that's everywhere. Yeah, I mean, I know we're running short on time, but I will say, like, aside from Adam's book, which you should read, I'm a big fan of Colin Dickey. He's a great, fascinating writer, and I quote him in the book. But I was always kind of fascinated. I grew up hearing about Native American burial grounds and curses, and it's like, first of all, that is totally the silliest stuff. Like, it's just like, it's so stupid. It's like, there's no cursed Native American burial grounds. But what Colin Dickey kind of points at is, this is just our sort of our underlying, you know, guilt and our self-hatred for, maybe it's something more, but like it's us, it's America not wanting to confront these things, all
Right,
these
it's a
things we've done.
settler mindset. Yeah.
Yeah, we just don't want to confront. And I, you know, the reason I wanted to write this book is because I'm like, you know, I just want people to be more honest about where they're from and where we're at, and where we're going, and you know, that's of the utmost importance, especially now.
I'm so sorry to break it up. I feel like we're just getting going, but we are running short on time. And I just wanted to make sure to thank you all so much for virtually coming out tonight, doing this event. It's fantastic. And yeah, just a big thank you from us.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Thank you
Thank
all.
you.
Can't wait to come back to Portland and visit you guys.
You got it.
Someday.
Yeah.
Good night,
Bye,
everyone.
guys.
Bye.
Bye.